Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us, both in person and those who are watching us online, for a very special Pride event at the Conduit to celebrate the publication of The Light of Day, a very excellent book about an extraordinary man called Roger Butler, whom we'll hear more about. So without further ado, I'd really like to dive into you, Christopher. How did you first meet Roger as a young undergraduate?
I met Roger actually when I first started my master's degree at Oxford. I had for some time been going to some dinners at Oxford, dinners of the like-minded, as we called it, which was code for gay men. And a good friend of mine had introduced me to this group, and I'd met through it an academic called Nick, who was going on a sabbatical year, and before he left, he asked if I would take his place to go and read to an older blind man who lived in East Oxford, and take Nick's slot, because he'd been reading to Roger for many years. And I knew at that point my role really was to be the gay reader, to read those things which perhaps some of his other readers weren't all that comfortable reading, or perhaps Roger didn't particularly want to be reading with them. So yes, I got on my bicycle in October of 2003 and rode into East Oxford and rang on his doorbell and met him there. That's when it all started.
And what were your first impressions of him?
Gosh, he had a very still, gentle presence. I remember that from the very beginning, and that's something which characterized Roger. He was a careful person intellectually. He was a careful person in terms of how he engaged with other people, but also how he held himself. And he was quite a shy man as well, a little reserved, and I think probably I was too, back in those days, perhaps still I am today. But he was very warm when I arrived, and I think he knew that it's a slightly odd experience to just roll up to somebody's door that you've never met, who's significantly older than you. It was my first proper encounter with a blind person as well, actually, and Roger, who had his sight when he was younger, was very aware and had thought a lot about the experience of sighted people interacting with blind people, and understood that it could be a little bit awkward. Sometimes people didn't necessarily know how to behave or what to say, and so he was very careful to try to make sure that part of it was easy, I think, for other people. Yeah.
Louise, I'm going to bring you in here. Did you ever hear about Roger from Christopher at all?
Not really while Roger was alive. Occasionally, Christopher would be busy, usually on a Tuesday night, although more throughout the week, and as we got older, he was off seeing his blind man, which is, I don't really love the way that sounds now, truthfully, but that is what he was doing. That was about all we knew about it, and then I learned a lot more about Roger after he had died, and then I learned a lot more about Roger's last request to Christopher, which was to write his life story. Sometime after that, well, that was something that Christopher was starting to explore more deeply and wonder how to take on this quite daunting task, to be asked posthumously.
Yeah, Christopher, how did that feel for you?
That request?
Yes.
Overwhelming, I think, is probably the truth of it. It wasn't something that Roger had said to me when he was alive, and it wasn't something that in exactly those words he said to me in the letters that he left me after his death, but it's something which is very clearly written into some of the things that he says in those letters. You know, I'm leaving you these papers, and you know why. And it took me some time really to think about the significance of the process that we had gone through, reading Roger's papers together, recording them, editing them, and looking back over and over again at Roger's life together, to realize that really that was Roger's way of educating me and him in his life, in what he thought was important, the kinds of stories about his life that he felt ought not to be forgotten. And as I described right at the beginning of the book, Roger left me a series of letters which I knew about. He didn't really want me to know about them, but I knew they were there, but I hadn't read any of them. It was his last letter correspondence, which went unsent. So after his death, I went through a slow process of reading them. It's quite a difficult thing to do, to read letters that your friend has written to you after they have died, and to experience the relationship that you had with them in their voice, not being able to respond to anything, not being able to answer back if there's anything in there that you feel that you might want to. So yeah, that was a very difficult process. It took me a very long time. Louise, I think, read more of those letters more quickly than I did to start with, but it was very encouraging that I go into them properly, as challenging as that was.
And in those letters, did Roger ever say, I came out in a letter published in public and I was one of the first people in Britain to do so? Or did you two come to that conclusion?
That would have
by
made life
yourself?
so much easier.
It would have been great, wouldn't it? Yeah.
Probably also would have guaranteed that Roger's story had been told in his own lifetime. But that was not something that Roger Butler saw about himself. He knew he'd written a letter. He thought maybe it might have been important and it might have made a small difference in the world. I don't think he really understood himself to be the first man to come out as gay, which we firmly believe he is. And he didn't necessarily know whether he had left a mark on the world in his life at all while he was alive. That really weighed on him in his later years, I think.
Yeah, he had a lot of friends that he thought were brilliant, some of whom were a bit famous, and many creative types as well. And when he compared himself at the end of his life to them, he found himself not to have failed, but really not to be at the same level as those people. He'd lived what he felt to be quite an ordinary life. And that was partly as a result of losing his sight and having to totally change the way that he related to the world and to other people. But that period of time when he was in London, part of the Homosexual Law Reform Society, and when he wrote his coming out letter, it was sort of ancient history by the time I met him, I suppose. It was youthful bravado, he describes it as. And so actually, when we read Roger's reminiscences together, there were parts of that I read which described his life in London, some of the things that he'd done there. And I knew that there was a letter that he had written that had some significance within the fight for gay rights at that time. But that was about it. And Roger hadn't kept that letter. And in fact, we later read from his reminiscences that he'd never read it again himself after he sent it. So he was too worried about being a bit embarrassed by it, and he would have wanted to have written it better, he thought, when he was older in life. But no, it wasn't something that really featured that significantly to him in his own personal narrative. And so it was only when we went back through the archives of The Spectator and eventually found that letter that we realized quite how important it was, because it wasn't just a man, like many others had done at the time, saying this silly law that makes any homosexual act illegal needs to be changed, it's ridiculous, or whatever line of arguing that people might have taken at that time. It was, for the first time, a man saying, this is about me, I am one of those people, and here's my name, and we'd seen nothing like that at all. And we spent some time then checking, looking around, saying, surely there were other people who had done something like this. And of course, there were gay men who were if you knew, you knew, and there were people who were even writing about the gay experience, but none of them was willing to say, this is about me. And so one of the letters that we quote in the book is from E.M. Forster, who's writing in support of law reform, and pretty much everyone knew.
Right.
But he doesn't say it. He wasn't willing to say, and this is about me as a person. So yeah, the significance of that letter, I think, only built in our minds as we did more and more research around that context at the beginning of the 1960s. Yeah.
And how did that feel when you realized, oh my gosh, this is actually something really historic we've uncovered here that everyone else seems to have forgotten?
think it was the explicitness of the letter that really hit me. It opens, "Dear Sir, we are homosexuals writing because," and we were writing because. And there's no dancing around it. There's no men of my nature. There's no I really feel badly on behalf of these people kind of things that were there in lots of letters that other people who we now know to be gay were sending. So it's the letter's really explicit. The other thing is that it's voluntary. No one would have known that Roger Butler was gay if he hadn't decided to tell the entire country that. He wasn't caught. This wasn't dragged out of him. He wasn't outed by anyone other than Roger Butler. And that, I think, is a huge claim. We felt it was probably true. And then when we looked back through every possible alternative claim that has come our way, we realized that really it's Roger Butler who did this thing first, voluntarily came out on his own terms.
And I think there was also, at that point too, a slight frustration that we started to feel because, we know all the names of these gay heroes of our past, but no one knows Roger's name. He did this amazing thing. And so the more important we felt the letter to be, the more irritating it was that no one knew who he was and that this thing had happened. Yeah.
And why do you think nobody knew? It was published in The Spectator, it went into the archives. Why do you think no one really picked up on it?
So it was picked up at the time. So a couple of weeks later, Roger features in a splashy double-spread tabloid feature about known homosexuals. And again, that's a first. That's quite dramatic for what it is. And Roger becomes an important part of the Homosexual Law Reform Society. He helps them to man their offices even at times. He gets involved in the Albany Trust, which is the charitable wing, and helps to get people writing in their newsletter, that sort of stuff. So he was a known quantity to the people who were part of that movement then. But there are a series of reasons, I think, why he slips out of the sort of view of history retrospectively. One is that movement changes anyway. So quite quickly into the 1970s, the Gay Liberation Front becomes a really radical movement, a very strong, sort of argumentative almost movement that says all of society needs to change. And people like Roger, people who took that perspective that he had done, which was to be a sort of quiet, gentle person who wasn't really challenging society except in this one way, to say we're like you except in this one way, and to criminalize that one thing is ridiculous, which was his point, and many of the other people that he was working with in the HLRS at the time. That becomes really unfashionable in the 1970s. So those sorts of people who still exist, people making that argument in the 70s, are called straight gays. And they're really hated by the GLF, or at least some people in the GLF, because the GLF wants to knock down all of the structures that are oppressing people left, right, and centre. The other is that Roger never really claimed credit for what he did. And so the fact that I didn't know about it is testament to that. He wasn't splashing his name himself in any of these forums. And the other, frankly, is that he started really to struggle with his vision in a very serious way the same year he wrote the letter. And very quickly his life becomes focused on managing that process, dealing with the loss of vision in one eye, then in the next. And so by 1966, he's become completely blind, and he has to grapple with how he can continue to survive in London as a working man, completely blind, and frankly in a society at that stage that thought, so suggested the best that we could really expect for blind people is that they might work on a factory line, or it really, there's a very diminutive, quite patronizing view that still predominates in that period around blind people. And so the support that he had to function was limited, and so he was battling a new battle by that stage.
And he was very young as well, relatively young, in his 20s when this all happened.
Yeah, he was born in 1935. Yeah, so young man, and really brave. I mean, certainly a brave man in 1958 to have answered the call that he saw in the New Statesman. Just a little advert saying this new thing, this Homosexual Law Reform Society has been created. We'd love you to come and help us, with a name at the bottom, and he just sort of goes and drops an envelope into a post box, and his whole life shifts enormously at that point. It's quite a radical thing to have done for a young man who didn't really know what he was about, and sort of hadn't really worked out his identity beyond having read a book that said this is what homosexuals are, and thought, okay, yeah, that's me too.
And Louise, paint a picture for me of how, gay life in London operated at the time. There was an enormous potential cost to Roger for coming out in such a public forum.
Yeah, gay life in London in the 50s was very vibrant in many ways that are not that different from now. There are clubs, there are pubs, there are house parties in somebody's basement in Peckham. And Roger goes to all these, but the difference is that you need to know somebody to tell you where to go and to take you there. It's underground in a way that just can't really be replicated in any way in comparison now. You had to know somebody who could take you where to go. And so it was operating, on the one hand, people are having a lot of fun, even during this time, Roger. But you risk losing your job, you risk having the police come to your house and look through your things, you risk being arrested. And what Roger did when he wrote a letter declaring himself to be a homosexual was to invite all of these things happening to him. The really funny thing is actually that they don't. Nothing terrible happens to Roger as a result of writing the letter, and it almost proves that it basically just took one person being willing to do this in order for everybody to discover that actually it's going to be awfully time-consuming to start hunting down all of the people who start publishing their names in the paper as homosexuals. So it doesn't happen. It sparks a flurry of conversation, but it is a period of fear, of secrecy, of shame. It's all of these things that we've been told the 1950s and early 60s were. But it's also a time where people were having a lot of fun, and it's also a time when one person was brave enough to do what Roger did. I think we often are told that coming out was invented in the 1970s. It's a gay liberation front thing. It's an American thing. And it is, except that it was also done 10 years earlier by somebody in England. And I think that matters. I think that changes our understanding of the timeline of gay rights quite considerably, and it's actually an important historical discovery.
One of the really interesting things that I've subsequently read other people who were living through this period in London say too is that duality of the extreme oppression with the fun sort of bubbling underneath is that there's almost an additional pleasure that people were finding in the fact that what they were doing was illegal.
Right.
It's
getting
sort of
away with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Sex was more fun when it was banned. Books are more fun to read if they've been banned. And lots of gay men who lived through the 1950s, early 1960s say that. And Roger calls it the great age of queerdom in the 1950s. There's this really rich queer life that's going on under the surface. And because it's illegal, it's not regulated, it's not clean, it's not polished, it's not on social media, it's not any of those things. It's kind of authentic to a divergent group of people who are willing to take the risk of saying this is who I am and sod it.
And what also struck me from reading the book is that it's also very diverse and multicultural. So people from all different class backgrounds, ethnic backgrounds, were kind of gathering together because they were united by this one thing on a purely need-to-know basis. Yeah,
and Roger talks about that as being one of the real advantages for two reasons. The first, that actually you do end up mixing with people that otherwise you probably never would have had the chance to meet. And he talks about going into some of these gay pubs in London and seeing celebrities, people off the TV, talking to sailors in uniform, and it's this sort of brilliant image of what some of those pubs must have been like at the time. But also that actually for a gay person who is entering those spaces for the first time, how much better it is to go into an environment where you're not always looking over your shoulder, where you're not always worried about what kind of illusions you might be making when you describe your home life, not having to make up a girlfriend or whatever, all of those things that when you're at work, when you're talking to your parents or your friends. Otherwise, you might just always have to be conscious of, and which many of us, if those of us who are gay or have come out as being anything at all, share that experience, I think, of having spent a period of our lives where we were just having to think all the time about, am I suggesting something by saying this, or should I make something up, or should I just change the gender of this person that I spent, whatever it might be. And for Roger, that was all the more important because it was criminalized. And so to go into a space where those social barriers are brought down, and immediately there's this common denominator, it's safe, it's finally a safe space, so to use that phrase, which they wouldn't have used in those days, but this is a place where I can be myself, is radically important for him.
And why do you think there wasn't any, I guess, police blowback from publishing that letter? Do you think that speaks to a sense that maybe society at the time was moving beyond that?
It's an interesting moment because the House of Commons is debating whether to decriminalise male homosexuality right around this time, and Roger's quite frustrated at how badly everyone's basically losing the votes for the next few years. It's one of the things that sort of propels him into this act. He hopes that it will shake things up. And so things are starting to change. He certainly gets very supportive responses to the letter that I think might reflect a public sentiment. He's also operating about five years after Peter Wildblood, whose book, like we said, Against the Law, had sort of prompted in Roger this self-discovery. But he also remembered the Wildblood trial vaguely himself from when he was reading about it in the newspaper while living at his parents' house in Banbury before coming to London. And he had this sort of vague recollection around then that while there was jeering when Wildblood left the court, the jeering wasn't at Wildblood, it was at the people who had turned on him and testified against him. And there was this sense that the state had overreached. And I think that gave Roger a confidence that the wind was changing, but that at the same time it wasn't going to change unless more people stuck their neck out. And I think the other thing about Wildblood is that while Wildblood is a hugely important person, not just for making Roger aware of who he is, but for really repainting the picture of homosexuality by writing a book on his own terms about who he is and saying it. The entire reason you had heard of Peter Wildblood is because you had all these grubby images around the arrest and everything else. And what Roger is doing is stepping out in a very sort of clean and transparent way to identify himself as a homosexual without handcuffs or a police officer standing by, all of which kind of almost then comes to justify the criminality around it, right? It must be bad because he's in court over it, and when Roger does it in a perfectly normal way in a newspaper, it puts it in a different light.
And when did both of you, having read all the letters, looked through all the documents, realized, oh, there's actually a book in this, there's actually a really important book that we could write together about the story?
It's a little, we got left the archive. Christopher got left the archive by Roger with this instruction to do something with it. So I think the starting question was always, is there a book in this? How on earth does he fulfill this request? Is it even possible? And he asks me in part to tell him, to let him down gently or to let him off the hook. I don't know which one of the two you were hoping for. But I think once we realized that Roger had done something hugely significant, which was not even the most significant thing Roger Butler himself thought he had done in his life, that seemed like the basis for a book. And then we also sort of, I think we probably questioned our sanity a couple of times, but it became almost circular. If Roger Butler had done something so important, surely people would have written about it. Why has no one written about it? But then maybe it is possible that actually this milestone could completely have been forgotten. And once we realized that was actually, the milestone was real, it really had been forgotten, and that people understood it to be true and at the same time had completely ignored it in the decades since, that seemed like the basis to proceed.
And I think that, as I was saying earlier, the fact that it had been overlooked to us tells another kind of story about who is telling history, or whose histories are we talking about when we look back on periods of time when significant things happened. And the fact that Roger slipped out from the view of historians primarily because he lost his sight. He was marginalized not just by sort of society in general, but actually by those group of people that he had been working with really hard and for whom he had done something really quite incredible. We felt that story needs to be told. the lives of people who are not lauded, celebrated, need to be told just as equally as anybody else.
And give me a sense of how big this archive was, because from the book I get the impression it was massive. How long did it take for you?
You say was. I mean, it's still in my house. It is, it's quite big. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. So Roger kept pretty much everything. He wrote his memoirs. He kept letter correspondences with the people, of which there were a number that he corresponded for many, many years, and he would keep a copy of his own letter and the letter that he received, which must have been so time-consuming. And in the early days, his pre-blindness letters, he drafts everything by hand and corrects things, and so you can see his process for then typing something and sending it off. But there are also shoeboxes full of tapes, and everything ranging from those big spool tapes that it's almost impossible to find a thing to play on anymore, which are recordings that he made when he went to Italy and met Lionel Fielden, who's in the book as well, talking about his own life. But those tiny, weeny little tapes that go in dictaphones and used to be in answer phones, there's a number of those. And as part of his process for writing, particularly letters, was to record himself. And so there are drafts and drafts of letters, including the letters to me, actually. It's quite an interesting thing to listen to Roger say these things just as much as to read it on the page. And one of the things we've done in the audiobook, actually, is to include some snippets of those recordings. So there are reams of things. I have every programme to every show Roger went to in the West End when he first moved to London. He was a hoarder. I think
very
we're really
organised.
A very organised
He
hoarder.
was not a hoarder, but he did.
An archivist.
Yeah,
he
absolutely.
was. I mean, the other thing is that, bear in mind, Roger can't see any of the things that he's created. He has a wonderful grasp on them. He can feel exactly what folder is which and where the papers, or whether these are letters or whether these are typed manuscripts. But he would sketch out an initial draft, particularly when he was writing his own memoir, because part of the archive is what Roger wanted the story of his life to really focus on, which is comprehensive and focuses perhaps on some things that are not that widely significant, but were very significant to him. Everything was significant to him. And to write it down, he would sketch it out in Braille. He would then sort of type it out. And then if he wanted to change anything, he would have to get somebody to either read it back to him or, latterly, to get somebody to read it out to him and then tape record the conversation so that he could go back and make changes. And he, with his memoir in particular, spent the last years of his life reworking the memoir over and over again. He just wanted to get that word choice a little bit different. I mean, I think anyone in the audience who's a journalist can probably both relate to this and also find it quite horrifying, because the idea that you can't even look back at your own work to change it, but you need to remember exactly what you've done and write it down in some way, record it in some way so that you can remember later, just is absolutely dreadful. Roger had many very nifty coping techniques here to do this, and an extraordinary memory that he just had to have. He didn't really have a choice about it. But the process is extraordinary, and the effort that he had to expend to create this is breathtaking. It also suggests to me always that Roger thought this was important enough to write down. There must be a reason. We probably should at least honor that by thinking about it again and again. Is this important to tell other people about?
And it's a really interesting book because the format of it is not just a historical retelling of Roger's archives and documents, but it's also telling of your relationship with Roger. How did you decide to come up with that format? Because it would have been really easy, I think, to kind of take yourself out of it, to just have it as a kind of straightforward biography of Roger.
Yeah, that process was sort of lengthy. We evolved in our approach to it quite a lot as we went along, didn't we? One of the original bits that I wrote was what I thought would be the introduction, which was explaining how I met Roger, why I had all of these materials, and why I wanted to write something about them. And it was quite a long piece. And alongside anything we showed of the historical stuff, to friends or to agents or whoever was sort of interested, that was always the bit that people focused in on. And a number of people said they cried when they read it and that they were really moved by that relationship. And so we knew that that material needed to be retained. The process of weaving those stories together, I think, was more that we felt that the two stories did actually interact with each other. And there was something about the pattern, too, of my visiting Roger, that sort of weekly journey, going and checking in with Roger, the fact that we would both talk about our lives, grow as friends, as well as reading material, set material. There was something about that sort of journey back into Roger's life as much as into our shared life that we wanted to echo somehow in the structure of the book. And we found, and I hope people who read it also find that there were so many common themes as well in terms of my experience of coming out and of moving to London even, and experiencing gay life in London that interacted with the experiences that Roger had through his life, that actually piling it all into a really long introduction or conclusion just didn't make much sense. We wanted a richness that was sort of, that weaved itself through the whole book.
And I think it really works. It's like an intergenerational memoir, really, of two different generations coming of age.
I think that's right. And not to minimize, by the way, the effort for Christopher of writing the interstitial passages, which at some point I think involved, gin and tonic and basically opening a vein to sort of pour out all of these feelings of a decade or more. But yes, and Roger, as we mentioned, Roger had a very important, influential, life-changing friendship with Lionel Fielden, who was 4 decades his senior when he read Roger's letter and wrote Roger a letter saying, it was a wonderful letter. And then from there, this 14-year epistolary friendship. They meet twice, but this is where all of the best material, I think, that was written contemporaneously by Roger. He didn't bother to keep a diary, or he did, but it was fairly perfunctory. Just describing the 60s to Lionel, who's living his somewhat best life in Italy, having gotten out of England. But anyway, Roger had this friendship with a gay man who could barely understand what Roger was telling him about gay life in London in the 50s. It sounded to him just completely fantastical. And then, from time to time, I think Christopher and Roger would have conversations about what gay life was like. There, you can see the echoes throughout, but the intergenerational nature of the echoes, I think, is very loud.
It's something that we've spoken about a lot, the two of us, as we've reflected on this book with people. That there is something distinctive about queerness which perhaps enables or encourages or permits us. Again, it's going back to that question you asked earlier about the bringing down of barriers. I think that somehow allows us to form relationships with people who are that much senior or junior to us in age, and to form friendships on equal terms, I think. And for the younger person, as it was for me with Roger, that's such a gift. That's such an amazing experience and opportunity to learn. That I'm so pleased that I had that gift. But I think it's something which we see quite often in queer relationships. That intergenerational thing it comes up a lot. It's quite frequent actually when you talk to people. And I've had. When you write a book, you start getting a lot of messages from people you never met before on Instagram or whatever, and the number of people who have written to me and said, oh my God, I had this kind of relationship with somebody, or I still have this kind of relationship with somebody, and it's really interesting to see that on a page. And I'm not sure that it's written about all that much, actually. I think it's important.
And it's really sweet that you've had people getting in touch to say, oh, I had a Roger, or I have a Roger, a friend just like him.
Yeah, a lot, actually.
Why do you think Roger didn't kick up more of a fuss about being forgotten by history, as it were? Because he was clearly, writing all of this stuff down, writing about his life. Do you think he just really didn't consider what he'd done to be that big a deal?
It's more an insecurity with Roger. He also harbored the idea that he might publish his memoir. He had many literary friends who offered to introduce him to their publishers, and then he just always stopped short because it wasn't quite good enough, and that got in his way terribly. But in addition, I think he spends the last few years of his life in particular just wrestling with this question of whether he had done anything worthwhile with his life at all. He recognizes he does, but he's also terrified that if he were to go out and say it, and people were to say, no, you didn't, and that would be the most awful thing that could possibly happen to him. And so he's a shy person. He's nervous about coming forward in a way that he's not nervous in 1960 about telling the entire nation that he's a gay man. But he sort of had this duality that I found strange and fascinating to uncover as somebody who never met Roger. And I think you probably had a different journey through also trying to understand the different facets of Roger.
Yeah, what do you think happened in those intervening decades to kind of, I guess, take him away from that bolshy young man who was able to come out so publicly without being afraid of the police knocking down his door?
I mean, the walls of his house, I think, from 1980 start to really constrain him. 1980 is the last year he has a guide dog. When Roger got a guide dog, it was all quite traumatic because he didn't like dogs particularly, and he was quite annoyed to be told he had to have one, and then later he recognized it was even more difficult to tell people he didn't really like guide dogs for the blind because they were a bit patronizing to you, and everyone was, oh my gosh, they're revered, you can't possibly do that. So he has a guide dog who's called Gay, which is also horrifying to him when he's first introduced to her.
It's one of the funny jokes.
I don't think it's in Leamington Spa in 1971 or 1972. It's just like, is everybody just taking the piss or something? But after Gay becomes old and is sort of retiring in splendor with a friend of his in Oxford, he has another guide dog called Cresco, and Cresco's a bit rubbish in various ways as a guide dog, and eventually he decides to send Cresco away, and that's very difficult too. He actually wrestles with it because he feels himself the pain of rejection, and he's had a relationship not work out the way he had hoped as well in the not too distant past, but the relationship hasn't worked out in the mid-70s. The guide dog is being sent away, and he just decides he doesn't have the energy to go through that all over again with another one. So he doesn't, but that confines him even more to his house than he already had been, his house in East Oxford. And the house is lovely by all accounts and by Christopher's recollection of it. He decorates the house to be beautiful and his place that he can control as much as he likes, but he really does live his life through there and through writing from there. He takes himself back to all the other places he has been, but he spends more and more of his time there, starting in 1980. Gets out a little bit more actually in the last years of his life with Christopher, but really that's where the walls start closing in, and I think where his potential role in history starts getting closed off as well. If anyone had been paying attention before, they sort of didn't really after then.
And Christopher, you essentially became his carer in his later age as he was diagnosed with cancer, which must have been really difficult for you. Was there anything you took away from that time, from your friendship, from your relationship with him?
Oh gosh, it would be, I think, an injustice to carers to say that I was a carer to him. I did what I could. He, thankfully, his sort of decline at the end was pretty rapid, and he ended up in a hospice. Journeying with someone through that process, I think, is a privilege as well, and something which I would never wish on anyone, but to have gone through it is extremely special. To have been with somebody as you make that decision to go into hospice care, knowing that that's, they're not going to come out, and then being with somebody as they go through a process of decline there as well, and being at someone's bedside when they die is an extraordinary experience, and I've taken an awful lot away from that just as a human being, I suppose, to have gone on that journey. I think there probably what is the most vivid memory of that time, actually, which is extraordinary given all of those bad things that were happening, is how joyful Roger managed to be in December. He dies early January, around Christmas. He loved Christmas, and we talk about that a little bit in the book. And I was able to be there with him around Christmas time and celebrate. And he made such an effort, even in those last weeks of his life, to set the table, bring out the starched napkins, get the posh cutlery, the nice glasses, that sort of stuff. And to be making the most of every moment, even within a very restricted, still in his house, still on his own terms, still very quiet, but actually to be finding joy in those moments, in those things that he had found joy in since he was a young man, is impressive, I think, and something which I would hope that I would be able to emulate when I'm older.
How do you think Roger would feel about the publication of the book?
I've been asked that a couple of times, and my first answer to that is probably correct my grammar. He wouldn't correct Louise's grammar, he'd correct my grammar, I'm sure. He was very particular about that sort of thing. I think he'd be a bit embarrassed, but a bit happy as well. I know he wanted this to be written. He wanted his legacy to be out there. But the thought of having his picture, and this is him on the front, the thought of that, I think, he would probably think was a bit funny and a bit much. But I'm glad. As I say, I think people should know who he is. People should see his face, and people should know his name.
And why do you think individual personal stories like Roger's are so important when it comes to history?
I think there are so many reasons. One is that it allows us to situate ourselves into moments of history in a way which a sort of grand sweeping narrative around how change happens or whatever it might be probably don't. This book is a story. We tell the story of a life, and through it we I hope weave in the historical narratives as they go, as they relate to him. But it's primarily about a man and his experiences. There are important things in terms of how those messages of history might be taken by us as readers, I think, as well. When a story is told about a person, an individual life, and in this case, it's particularly around what it is to come out, to put yourself in that position, and how important it is for other gay people, for straight people alike, to recognise that this category of person, this thing, these homosexuals who are so reviled and so sort of grubby and over there, are actually just human beings like everybody else. And to see Roger's life lived out as a human being who goes to a party and thinks it's really fun and a bit scandalous that three men go off into the bedroom together, and who kind of tries out cottaging because it's kind of the only thing that's available to him, but doesn't really like it. All of that sort of rich tapestry of a real human being who happens to be this other thing too allows us, I think, to empathise, yes, but also to sympathise with it and to say, gosh, how extraordinary that this person did this thing.
It's also exactly what Roger was trying to do when he wrote the letter. Homosexuality was an abstract issue, a topic that was primarily discussed, at least by people who were supportive of decriminalisation, as something that was very sad, and the best way to get treatment for these poor people was to do decriminalisation. So you would have all of these straight people standing up and saying all of these well-meaning but desperately irritating things. And Roger realized that it was probably quite important for a homosexual to speak for themselves. One, because it said, we're not talking about homosexuals, we're talking about me, Roger Butler here, and my friends. I'm a seemingly, as much as you can convey this over the course of a letter, normal, erudite, rational person, and I don't see anything wrong with it. As proof I don't see anything wrong with it, this is my real name, not a name I'm hiding behind, but actually who I am. And so that normalizes it. It sort of also puts a person out there for other people to look at and say, okay, that might be me, and a visible beacon there. And that, at least in the history of gay rights, is pretty much how anything happened. It became not a faceless thing, but a very specific thing about Roger Butler and people like him. So the idea that an individual story is actually necessary to move things along, I think, is an important story, at least about the important message about the 1950s and 1960s, at least, and you can take what you want for it about today.
Do you think he sort of almost invented coming out, in a way, before the term was even invented?
Yes. Yes, he did.
We can steal that one from America, then.
Totally. Well, if actually we cite a couple of letters in here where he uses that phrase in 1960. And so Roger, later on, he says, coming out of the closet, which was a phrase that no one had thought of at the time when he did it. But actually, he had thought of it. He literally writes it down on the page and sends it off to Italy. So, yeah, he did.
Wow. I mean, I think he'll be very happy with the book.
I hope so.
More broadly, reflecting on the journey to bringing this book to publication, what do you think is the best way for people to bring about social change? Is it through, things like what Roger did by using personal story, personal testimony, or do you think, the 8 days of that are long over and we need to start thinking of different ways to bring about social progress?
Shall I? I mean, that's a knotty question, isn't it? But my view is that personal stories matter more than ever now. I think we're so quick to dehumanize people. We're so quick to think about us and them, whatever the category of them might be in any situation. We can think about faceless migrants, but if we have a person, a human being in front of us who's starving or whose home has been destroyed or who's come across a sea, whatever it might be, that it's much harder to deny that instinct for compassion, for love, for respect, that sense of the dignity of the person. If you know a name, a story. So I think it's as important as ever, if not more so, yeah.
I was finally going to ask, because we have some time for questions at the end of this. It's really interesting, I think, what you flagged about, there was a conversation happening about gay acceptance, but it was mainly seemed to be held by straight people. And what Roger did was kind of focus the attention back onto gay people like him. Why do you think he suddenly realized the importance of that? What do you think in his life led him to kind of realize, actually, this isn't quite right?
I think it's being part of it. He has a transformational moment when he goes to his first HLRS meeting, which, by the way, is being held in the house of somebody who's already basically put his address in the paper. So pretty brave person too. But there he meets 4 queers and they chat queer talk all evening. And that's the first moment where he feels the significance of, I think, being surrounded by a lot of different gay people. Certainly more than one person in a garden shed kind of situation. So he has other gay people around him. And then the more time he spends with them, I think the more he realizes that everything he might have read in the newspaper about homosexuality doesn't ring true with his experience. So that's part of his progression. But I think ultimately it's just sheer irritation. He's in the audience at Caxton Hall where there's this parade of speakers. There's the Bishop of Oxford who says horrible things. This is in support of law reform, to be clear, but he says absolutely horrible things about homosexuals there. And then there's a Justice of the Peace who stands up and says how horrifying it would be if her sons had to face this problem in her lifetime. And Roger, ultimately ends up saying, I'm somebody's son. You might know me, and once you start to think of this as a problem associated with me, you might start to think about it differently. But the irritation from that particular meeting tips him over the edge, and he goes to the pub with his friends, and he gets very fired up, and he says, "What the hell? Why? What have we got to be ashamed about?" So that's how the letter is born, and from there he ends up beginning, I think, the process by which gay men did start to take control of the organization operating in their name. A couple of weeks later, he is there when the newspaper wants to interview supporters of law reform to paint both sides of the debate. But I think had Roger not come out when he had, he probably wouldn't have been there. It's not necessarily clear any other gay men would have been there. And so the conversation, again, would have been led by supporters and opponents of law reform, but none of them identifying themselves, certainly as gay people, and possibly not even being gay people. So it was really, I think, just looking around him.
I mean, the arguments of the straight people involved in the HLRS at that stage are really crap. I mean, it's all about, calming the fears of homophobic people. So, there's no evidence that if we decriminalise, then there'll become more homosexuals. Because, of course, the idea that there would be more homosexuals is the worst idea. So we need to make sure that we're not going to be creating more opportunities for homosexuality. And there's another guy at that meeting, Lindsay Newsutter, who talks about, well, don't worry, not all gay people are like those pansies over there who bleach their hair and might have, jewelry or whatever, or those really Nancy boys over there, as they call them. There's some perfectly standard ones, and this sort of horribly demeaning ways that homosexuals are talked about, alongside women and other groups too. I mean, the gays are not the only ones suffering here, but it needs gay people to say, we're okay. Yeah, we exist.
More than okay.
More than
More
okay.
than
Yeah,
okay.
we're great. Yeah. Wear jewelry. It's fun.
Are you in talks of any, I think museums, archivists, curators must be interested in at least having a look at his materials and archive?
We've been in touch with some, but I think, again, the fact that Roger isn't known about has made people slightly hesitant in terms of an enthusiasm for embracing the story. So I hope as the book gets some attention, then more people will be interested. We've certainly, one of the interesting discussions we've had was with the British Library, who hold the Hall Carpenter Oral History Archive, and that's one place that has a record of Roger, an oral history that he did in the 1990s, and other people who are involved in the gay law reform movement, and they've been very helpful in terms of the publication of this book. So there are interested individuals, but again, because the name isn't, it's not Harvey Milk or anyone that we all know, then actually it's taking a while to get some traction with those sorts of institutions, I think, who are naturally quite cautious about how they approach these things. But we're hoping they'll come running soon.
Yeah, I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
I'd love to open the space up to questions now. If anyone's got a question, please raise your hand. We've got mics. There's someone in the front row. Oh, you've got a mic coming up behind you.
Thank you very much. A couple of things, please, really. I know that Roger was gay and blind and brave, but I have no idea what else he was. What else did he do? And why was he still in Oxford? And part of the reason I asked that is I've been immersed, for several months now, in researching the sort of Oxford milieu of the 30s, late 20s and 30s. And it was breathtaking. And there were dons who were there then, breaking every rule under the sun, who would still have been there when Roger was there. They were still in there in the 60s, and some of them were pretty sodden and pathetic, and some of them were still very brave and remarkably liberal, but still sort of hiding to some extent. There are still papers that can't be released after 50 years. So it's just, what was he still doing there? Was he an academic?
It's a great question.
How did all this link up?
Roger's lifelong ambition that he was too afraid initially to act on was to go to university and read for a degree. And to go to university and read for a degree. And after he becomes blind and he decides he can no longer continue to do his job in London, he decides that now is a perfect time because he has absolutely nothing left to lose, although he also has literally everything to lose. He knows if he gives up the job, he's not going to get another one easily. And so he manages to claw his way to Balliol College, Oxford, where he then reads for a history degree, where he is taught by some of these really fun Oxford dons who make great guest appearances. He gets, by the way, Christopher Hill is the master of Balliol at the time, and Christopher Hill is this great pioneer of history from below that has absolutely no idea that he has this revolutionary in his midst and would never have recognized Roger to be that, certainly the way he comes across in Roger's recollections of him. But he's a student there. I think an interesting research project for someone, not necessarily you, because it sounds like you've got a lot going on, but Oxford in the early 1970s as a place for disabled students is really quite shocking. Roger's experience as a blind student is, at the first part of it, he's delighted to be accepted. And they ask him, well, how are you going to manage? And he says, well, I suppose I'll find a way. I've always found a way so far. And then it's left to him to find a way to manage. Roger gets a third-class degree because he's not able to do the reading for one of the papers, and nobody thinks that this is the sort of thing that might merit an accommodation of any kind. I actually don't work in higher ed, so I'll let you sort of jump in now about hopefully how different this is.
I think things have changed a little bit, yes. But by that stage, Roger had been an estate agent in London, and the reason that he leaves and then decides to go to Balliol is that it just proves impossible to continue that life. He does everything he possibly can, because the idea, as I was saying earlier, around blind people in those days seems to be let's give them something useful to do. So if you've got a job, then that's kind of the golden ticket. So Roger managed, it's by just sheer effort, will to get back to the office where he'd been working before he lost his sight. There's this moment where he walks into that office for the first time, having made the journey from Fulham into central London with his guide dog Gay for the first time, where everyone in the office stands up and cheers, and it's all very delightful. But it's hateful, that experience, because there's one bus that he can get that is accessible, 6:30 in the morning, he has to get every single day, and then he fights his way to get onto a bus home at Marble Arch with no assistance, and he's exhausted. His life sort of becomes really very thin at that stage. So when he's been in Balliol for 3 years, and all of his much younger friends at that stage, because he's pushing 40 by this point, are off to London to their glittering careers, he can't think of anything worse. He just doesn't want to go back. So he's already, by the time he finishes, sold his house in Fulham, moving into Oxford, and he starts doing some private tutoring, and then there he stays for the rest of his life.
We've got another question over here.
I think it's fantastic that you've produced something that provides a little historical context of the pre-67 life and world for homosexuals, and the excitement of being gay when it's illegal, and the fear and the dread of potentially being arrested, losing everything. And there are not that many people in this room who can remember that life. But I think as we go into sort of LGBT, whatever, History Month, we should also remember that 67 wasn't the change for everyone. As a soldier, they had to wait another 33 years until the year 2000, until the law was changed and it was legal to be gay in the military, which is a staggering thought. But I think looking back on the pre-67 life and the insights into that, which are now dying off, and there are very few people, or relatively fewer people who remember that, I think it's a fantastic job that you've done.
Thank you, and I suppose I'd say, you know, one of the nice things about the moment now is that there seem to be a number of writers who are looking into this period and trying to revive the primary sources that exist from that time. But a lot of the people who lived through it are no longer with us, either because of age now, or you know, there's a whole generation of people who died of AIDS as well. So actually some of the stories that could be told about that period haven't been told and won't ever be told. So I mean, now is the time still to find the people who lived through that world, through those experiences. I mean, your point about the military, you know, is incredibly important. And of course, you know, Northern Ireland, Scotland, not the same. You know, things changed at a very different pace. But even in England, after the law changed, more men were arrested for homosexual activity than were arrested in the year before the law changed. So the police go on a rampage, basically, which many people interpret as a sort of homophobic reaction to the change in the law. It's still criminal to do anything that isn't sort of two men locked into a house on their own.
Over the age of 21.
Over the age of 21.
We've got another question in this side of the room.
Something that comes up early in the book is Roger's discovery of this book for himself when he's a young man that helps him realise who he is and his identity. And I think I remember you also mentioned that you both had similar experiences of literature and, I'm assuming, film and television also, for sort of making you feel like you were part of a community and understand your identity. And I'm actually kind of interested, obviously now you've written a book that's part of that canon as well. I was wondering if you might just tell me a little bit about maybe a little bit about either those moments for you, or what those books or film or television, Queer as Folk, might have been the L word.
Yeah, I think everybody in the audience probably has a book that changed their life at some point. And our experience of the year 2000 was that Queer as Folk was on TV. Dawson's Creek had just happened. I mean, you can very clearly age people in this respect by exactly what was the thing they remember from their pivotal year. But those were the big ones. Those were the big ones for us. I think, you know, Jack and Ethan is just. I've lost probably 3/4 of you, but for the quarter of you that remember Jack and Ethan, that was huge. This was the first gay kiss on TV, and that just felt huge. The bookshops in general had a fair amount of stuff. We were in Gaze the Word yesterday for a signing, and I swear that sort of the content in Gaze the Word is probably quadrupled since I was there in the early 2000s looking for stuff.
Morris, probably for me.
Very literary.
Yeah, I know. It suggests highbrow. I wasn't a very highbrow person. Brideshead, you know, a little bit gay. And I friends of my mother's, I think, gave me, was it an ITV serialization of Brideshead? That really, really long one with Jeremy Irons in. Just before I went up to Oxford, and that was a kind of, oh, okay, this is a way to live.
They knew what they were doing.
Yeah, exactly. And I think to be able to see, respectable is probably the wrong word, but to see kind of, you know, middle class kids in an environment that you're going into, living a gay life that perhaps is less, more likely to be the experience I have than a Dawson's Creek, and probably, frankly, a Queer as Folk, given who I was. Yeah, those sorts of things which aren't necessarily making too many points at you, but which are kind of casually throwing in the gay characters or insinuating homosexuality in them into a really nice book as well. Yeah.
Do we have any more questions? Well, I think that's it then. Well, thank you so much for coming to speak to us about The Light of Day. And for those of you who haven't bought the book, it will be available on the stand there where you can get it signed.
You can't leave unless you have.
Yes, you can't actually leave. It is part of the membership of the Conduit. They don't tell you that, but you know, they should make a bigger deal of that in their newsletter. But once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to Christopher Stephens and Louise Radnofsky for the fascinating book. I hope you'll join me in applauding them on this huge accomplishment. And I'm sure the British Museum or the British Library will be in touch.
So,
Thank you.